we will have coffee.
Oh,
just to
okay.
let you know.
Oh, great.
I feel very bad about sending you out here at the crack of dawn with no coffee.
Oh, that's no problem. Well, I'll just read this out. Get it on the record.
Okay, sure.
Heather O'Donnell grew up in the library stacks and bookstore aisles of suburban Delaware. In 1989, she moved to New York City, where she studied English at Columbia and held down a series of bookish jobs on the side, working the cash register at the Strand, shelving photobooks in the Avery Library, sifting the slush pile at Grand Street. Grand Street is a publisher?
Grand Street is a literary magazine.
Ah, okay. While writing her doctoral dissertation in the Yale English department, Heather worked as a curatorial assistant at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. From 2001 to 2004, she joined the Princeton Society of Fellows, then left academia to pursue the rare book trade full-time. For 7 years, she worked as a bookseller in the New York Gallery of Bauman Rare Books, dealing in a wide range of material from incunabula to modern firsts. In the fall of 2011, she founded Honey and Wax Booksellers in Brooklyn. In 2017, she and Rebecca Romney established the annual Honey and Wax Book Collecting Prize of $1,000 for a young woman book collector. Heather is a member of the Grolier Club, the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, the International League of Antiquarian Booksellers, and a graduate of the Colorado. I think you're teaching there now, aren't you?
I am on the faculty there now,
Okay.
yes. But I started as a student.
I see. Very good. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you so much for having me.
You studied English at Columbia. Who's your favorite author?
I think that when I was at Columbia, I probably would have said William Faulkner, and I still do love William Faulkner. I think that as I get older, I have less and less of a favorite author, and just more favorite books.
And why is that?
I don't know. I guess my intense personal identification with individual people has kind of lessened, and I'm more willing to listen to a variety of perspectives.
So is that reflected in your collecting? So you go after specific books rather than completing authors?
I think that's certainly true. I mean, of course, I do work on, private collections that are completist, and do my best to make that happen. But I would say that I tend to, in my own buying for stock and just in terms of what interests me, be more interested in unusual things that don't necessarily fit the standard bibliographies.
So do you find that you're being requested to be a completist on behalf of your clients more so now, or less?
No, I would say less so. I think that in general, people tend now to feel a little more free in their collecting. And also, with the major authors, being a completist typically involves having to spend an enormous amount of money for the early books. So unless you're really down for that, most people are happy to have, their favorite title, or, one or two representative titles of their favorite author, and then go somewhere else.
Okay. So you find that people are collecting high spots as much as they used to, or exploring untilled terrain?
Well, I do sell high spots, and I'm grateful for high spots because they pay the rent. But I do think that high spot collecting, because it has become so unaffordable for all but a very small percentage of people and institutions, I think a lot of people have just gotten a bit more creative and flexible in terms of thinking about what they'd enjoy collecting and what kind of contribution they might be able to make in collecting, which typically isn't collecting the high spots, since everyone already knows what they are, and they're already well represented institutionally.
It's kind of unimaginative, isn't it?
I would never denigrate anyone's relationship to their books, because it's very personal and I think enormously rich. And I think everyone can have an incredibly, obviously, strong connection to, say, a Shakespeare folio. But I do find myself drawn to collectors, and I think probably the reverse is more true. Collectors who are interested in more unconventional pathways tend to be drawn to me and to dealers like me who are more open to looking at unusual material or trying to think about ways to organize material outside of standard collecting practices, like being a completist of an author, for instance, or going chronologically down a publisher's bibliography, or that kind of thing. But then again, I would just say I do that too, and have no problem doing it. And that's another way to organize information and to experience the books. So I always learn something, however I do it.
So, what are some examples of unusual pathways then?
Well, one actually that I haven't actually done yet, but we've just started this week, is that at the Swan sale this week, the lot number 1 was a note from Edmund Burke to his bookseller, Dodsley, asking Dodsley to send over one of Burke's recent books. And I wound up buying that on behalf of a customer who is a big fan of Burke, and I'd alerted him to this. But then he and I were talking about interesting historical figures writing to their booksellers. Isn't there a collection there? I mean, wouldn't that be a really fun thing to pursue? Like, that's not a category I had really thought of as a category, but what if it is one? So he went back and found a couple of examples in extra illustrated books that he has, just mixed in are various people writing their booksellers. And so I think we're going to look for primarily 18th century examples of correspondence between not just writers, but just people of interest and their booksellers. So that's the kind of thing that I didn't think of that as a collecting area 2 weeks ago, and today I think of it as a collecting area. And I feel like that's what's fun about this job, is that whatever your interest or whatever you become interested in, you can pursue unfettered and without shame. So
I think a bona fide collector will come up with a new idea once a month, or at least that's what I find.
I think that's what makes them bona fide collectors in a way. That's it's that curiosity and that openness to material,
and a way of thinking, how can I organize what's out there in a different way,
and see something in it that you didn't realize was there. One of the fun things about collecting in general is that sometimes you see something and it's a little bit weird, and one of them is just kind of a curiosity, and maybe 3 or 4 of them are just kind of a curiosity. But if you have 100 of them, suddenly it does become very interesting, because patterns emerge, and you get to read all kinds of narratives in it that you weren't aware of. One of the things that I collect here, just as our house collection, down there on that bottom shelf, are American and English publishers' bindings that depict women reading on them. None of those books are expensive, but having them all together, I'm always looking for examples of them. It is really interesting because it shows you all kinds of, different ways that domestic space is organized, and the way, the role that education plays, whether she's a scholarly girl or whether she's doing something bad by reading a novel. There's a whole story about the social place of reading for women and girls in those images. So it's fun.
A couple things. There's a book of paintings of people reading.
Yes. There are several, I think, actually, because it's a venerable subject. I like it very much, but I have very narrow rules for this collection, because people are always pitching me pictures of fairy tale books where you see a woman reading to her children, but these books have to be a woman reading for her own pleasure, for her own interest, a woman reading for herself. So she's not being a mom. She's actually the book is for her.
So how did you start this? Did you go online and just look at all you can't search?
No,
you can't search it. You just sort of look at a lot of images, I guess.
You look at a lot of images. It started because I had bought a couple just spontaneously because I thought they were so pretty, and I responded to the imagery. And then I thought, I wonder if it would be possible to do like a collection of this. And no, it's a little tricky. It often helps to search by publisher, actually, because they did tend to be on sort of standard young girls novels, kind of, that's popular fiction. Often publishers would put the same image in different colorways on 20 different titles, in the 1880s or 1890s. So
you should talk to Richard Minsky.
Richard Beinecke knows about this collection. He's obviously someone who knows more about this kind of material than almost anybody. I'm still really learning, but it's fun because I Instagram them, and then people will write me and say I have this, or I got a text from someone in a shop in Paris, snapping a picture. Do you want this? Is this for you? Yeah. So one thing that's nice about collecting at this hour is that if you are working on a project, you can potentially share that project with lots of people you don't even know, and they can all kind of chip in and say, like, hey, did you notice such and such, or have you seen this? Like
crowdsourcing almost.
Exactly. Yeah. Which I find really exciting. I think that one of the things that's most interesting about book collecting at this moment in history is that people are collaborating on collections at a much earlier stage because of social media. You can become aware of what someone across the country is doing and what they're getting in a way that was not possible before that. And as a result, I think it makes for I like the collaborative aspect. It's not that I don't also like the private obsessive aspect, but I feel like there are two sides to my personality, and I like to share things. I like to talk about things. So,
well, I think that's a big part of collecting itself, is this desire to share.
That's certainly what I have found among collectors, and it's why I enjoy my work, because you get invited into someone's sort of sensibility for a little while and get a sense of what interests them and excites them and what they notice that you don't notice or hadn't never noticed before. It expands the way that you respond to material. And I feel really lucky to have met so many really creative and ingenious collectors in my life. A really great collection is creative in a way that is very unique and really inspiring. And the nice thing about them is that you don't have to be enormously wealthy to build a collection that's really interesting and really revelatory. And that's something that I feel, I feel like everyone in the trade just needs to hit as hard as they can all the time, because the press is so obsessed with prices and with auction records and that kind of thing, understandably, because that writes the headline for you. But to make clear that you don't have to have millions of dollars to have a really interesting collection. And in fact, the collections that are going to be most sought after in the future are probably the ones that are being created right now by really strange, eccentric people that no one is paying attention to, picking up material that no one is paying attention to. And it's precisely because of that it's going to wind up being really important for historians.
Well, I was in the Phillips room at the Grolier.
Isn't that the greatest?
And yeah, it looks like an installation piece. Was it Thomas Phillips?
I think Thomas Phillips, his closet just
looks like
a hoarder's
it looks like a bunch of unrolled wallpaper all scrapped up. And this was part of his collection, and he collected all sorts of stuff that nobody wanted. And it's exactly as you've said, his collection has rendered all sorts of interesting detail about everyday life.
Yeah.
I've got a collection of publishers' histories, and they don't cost very much at all.
Sure, and that's such a perfect example, because that's the kind of thing where I'm sure you can pick those up very cheaply. Yeah. People don't
I try to get them
notice
signed too, and they're still, you can get them for under $50 typically.
Of course.
Yeah.
And yet, what a great collection that will that will be, and how excited will someone be to see that in 100 years, to see all those publishers together, signed. This evidence of the production of this material. It's so exciting.
The other thing too, and you mentioned letters, and this idea of ephemera and the unique object. It seems that lots of booksellers I'm talking to are saying that this is the direction that the industry, quote unquote, the trade.
The trade.
Is,
yeah, I never use the word industry. This isn't an industry. We're not producing anything.
Right,
We're just moving
right.
things around.
Is moving in, is this idea that this is the only one of its kind.
I mean, certainly that's the tack that Honey and Wax has taken. And I think, yeah, most people, because it is increasingly difficult to sell books of which there are 20 and 30 extant copies, online. Like, it just is not a remunerative business model at all.
Yeah.
And so to get people's attention and their business and their loyalty, you have to consistently be putting things in front of them that they do not see anywhere else. And on the one hand, I love that because it's intellectually much more rewarding than just, typing another Kurt Vonnegut novel into the database and like duping it. But on the other hand, it's an enormous amount of work. And you can't rely on duplication in the same way. If you are handling a set list of high spots, then when you sell one, you get another one, and you tweak the description and you move that one out. If you're doing, a sort of complicated archive or an unusual, association copy or something like that, you put all this research into it, you sell it, it's so exciting, but there's not another one. It's not like that labor is now sunk, and you now need to find something else, and I'll learn about that. So I certainly feel like for me, that is, continues to be a real struggle in terms of managing my time and finding that balance between handling material that I can catalog very fast because it's completely known material and it's just a matter of, checking the bibliography and making sure that it's correctly described, and finding stuff that is often really, really rewarding to work on, but it's not really worth that much. You can add value,
too much effort
but
and labor into it, right?
Right. If you cannot sink an entire day of research into something that you're going to sell for $250, you just can't. So I struggle with it all the time, and I would think that most sole proprietors struggle with it because it's the constant back and forth of needing to have unusual, distinctive material, but also needing to have just bread and butter stuff coming through all the time, and how you apportion your very finite time to get it all done.
Yeah, it's a bit like the entrepreneur who goes out and has to work to get the business, then she has to actually do it, and while she's doing it, she's not going out and
getting the business. Certainly, I would say that this is my 8th year on my own, and it's still something that I am constantly recalibrating and rethinking and tacking right or tacking left to make it work out. And I think that's very much the case. It's just sort of a constant hustle. If you're very lucky, if you get a big collection, but then you have to deal with it, and then you're not dealing with other things, and so it's I haven't solved that problem, and I don't know that I ever will.
Right. So from Columbia, you went to Yale, and your PhD dissertation was on the lecture tours of Henry James and Gertrude Stein. So how did those two differ?
Well, I worked at the Beinecke as a curatorial assistant for Pat Willis, who was then the curator of American literature. And at some point, I had to go down to answer some correspondence inquiry, because this is before email, and you had to actually write letters to people who wrote in. And I wound up looking at these scrapbooks that were in the Beinecke that I would never have looked at on my own, that had been kept by someone chronicling Gertrude Stein's lecture tour of the United States in 1934, 1935. And I was just captivated by these scrapbooks. And I knew Henry James's work very well, Stein much less. But Stein is, of course, a great strength of Yale's collection. They have her papers, they have Carl van Vechten, they have, lots and lots of people around her in her circle. And as I was reading up on her lecture tour, she said that Henry James was really her only forerunner. And I thought, that's so strange. What would he think about that? He would be, of course, Stein was very close with William James, who was her teacher at Harvard. But Henry James never even consented to meet her. He was not interested in her at all. And I wondered what she meant. So it was that kind of curiosity of just thinking like, what could that be? So as I started researching his tour and his book and her tour and her book, I began to think about, the ways in which these were both Americans who expatriated for many decades, lived abroad, signified in the American imagination a kind of effete European avant-garde, complicated, no one can understand what they write. Why do they write like this? They're so hard to understand.
Not James, though, but...
James, too, absolutely, in the United States.
Nobody could understand what he wrote?
The older he got, no, they could not. Why does he talk like that? Those long, circuitous sentences. Why doesn't he just get to the point? What's the plot? We don't understand. These long novels which deal with someone's... Yeah, they're beautiful, but they were not bestsellers in the United States. Yeah. I mean, he was successful when he was very young with The American and Portrait of a Lady, but by the time you get to The Golden Bowl and The Ambassadors and he's a joke. People are literally baffled by what is happening. Both of them, of course, were gay, or at least. Stein was certainly gay.
He wasn't.
James was. Who knows what James was? But he was not a conventional heterosexual guy. He was not a manly man.
Yeah.
Just as she was not at all a womanly woman. They both presented in different ways. And they both, after years abroad, come back to the United States and travel all the way across the United States, visiting all these places where they had never been or had not been for 20, 30 years, giving lectures, explaining what they were trying to do in their work, trying to explain what their sense of what literature is to a crowd that was kind of there in a way to sort of, out of curiosity, but also, a little bit like bafflement. You want to see this freakish creature who's landed from Paris or London to talk about, their weird, circular, complicated writing that doesn't seem to be about American themes.
So she said that he was her only real predecessor?
Yeah.
And what? In the sense that he was trying to explain his literature?
Well, she doesn't say in what sense. Stein never explains anything, right? She just said he was the only one who understood, what I was doing. He was the only one.
You wanted to understand.
So I wanted to understand. I thought, in what possible universe could that be true? And as I, sort of looked into parallels, I was like, even though these are two very, very different figures who are not frequently discussed together, in fact, there are some interesting parallels, and I could see why she would see in his writing and in his particular kinds of experiments with language something that appealed to her. And that even though her writing is not at all like his writing, that she would see something in his practice that would resonate with her, and in his position, in the person who withdrew from, his powerful family in the United States to create his own world in Europe. So ultimately the dissertation was about reading her book on the United States, Everybody's Autobiography, as a kind of revision of the American scene, James's book, looking at the ways in which she picks up on things that he talks about there, but recasts them in ways that, sort of point to herself as the avant-garde and as the one who is now leading literature into the future. But picking up on a lot of the same observations. And then also just the background, a kind of, history of literary celebrity in America and the way that people responded very differently to them. One thing that was funny about it is that Stein was absolutely, of the two of them, as you were saying, completely the more out of the two. She lived with Alice B. Toklas. They lived fairly openly as a couple.
And they could do that in Paris.
Or they could do that in Paris. In the United States, everyone, literally all the papers, I didn't see a single homophobic thing. They would talk about her, the way she dresses and that kind of thing, but they were just like her secretary, Alice B. Toklas. Completely casual, whereas James was constantly on the receiving end of really nasty kind of homophobic insinuations. Although he did not live with a partner and had never had, a male partner in the public eye or anything like that. But it was interesting that male homosexuality was in a way much more visible. People were more willing to talk about that or see it.
Well, whereas, and it's also more culpable, I think, too, in the eyes of society and the law.
I suppose that's probably the case too. That it just seems like, well, even if they are, they're just it's harmless. What could that sort of.
Well, and look at the tragedy of Oscar Wilde, speaking of tours of the United States.
Well, exactly. And of course, he's the figure who was also in the background of this dissertation, although he was, of course, not an American originally, so it doesn't, but he was the one who really set the set the tone for the big, splashy American lecture tour. And
Dickens, of course.
Dickens, yes. Dickens was also a big one. Yeah.
So what have you gone after? Books that obviously you've read everything, so you must be interested in acquiring books connected to this, no?
Well, I wrote that dissertation, 25 years ago. Like I've been read a lot since too. Like I'm interested in different things, but yeah, I continue to really enjoy James and Stein, neither of whom honestly bring a particularly high premium. Neither of them are really in vogue right now as far as rare books go. I've sold both of them, but they don't move very briskly.
Who does move briskly?
Let me think. The material that moves fastest out of here in recent years has been material related to education. Literary education, art education, science education, math education.
History too, no?
History too.
But what are you talking about? Actual textbooks? Or,
no.
Or the philosophy of education?
I'm talking about philosophy of education, but also material that speaks to the way that classical literature or canonical ideas in math and science are disseminated broadly. So rather than the high spot first edition of, say, like Newton's Principia, like, say, a Victorian book that would explain Newton's theories to young women, something like that. Ways that material reaches audiences that it wasn't originally aimed at, but the way it gets disseminated, whether that is actual educational material or things like advertising or different elements of graphic design that bring the iconography of sort of high art history into everyday life. The way that people who weren't the original audience of this material eventually come to it and come to understand it.
Broader society is now
grappling with Freud or grappling with that kind of thing. And the reason I think that kind of material is so successful is that it appeals to private collectors who collect the thing in question, who already have all the first editions and the sort of, the standard works. They like to see, they have the core of the collection, but then this offers a way to sort of see that material folding out in time, and they like that. Yeah. And institutions love it.
It's fun.
It's enjoyable. It's usually very quirky and, sort of surprising, and it tells you something interesting. Institutions love it because it's stuff that's great in the classroom. If you're teaching a text, to be like, and here's how, an American boy in 1810 might have encountered Plato. Like, this is how he would have done it. He would not have done it through, an Aldine printing. He would have done it this way, and this is how it would have come to him, and this is how it would have fit into the context of the early national period and the way the Republic was aiming at a kind of classical standard for itself.
The other thing that's fascinating is looking at how these different texts or presentations, what they exclude, what they include, how they describe indigenous people, for example, or women,
and the way that changes over time. The way that that is a really so it's a good institutional sell because it has classroom use. Professors like it. You can imagine people writing dissertations on. You can see the way there's a lot, and it doesn't tend to be enormously expensive. Yeah. So it's the kind of thing that people feel like, oh, it's $1,000. Like, okay, I could see. Lots of people can sort of get in on it at that level, and that's a category. It's not a single author, but that kind of material is something that I am buying really aggressively because it sells fast.
And where do you get it from? eBay?
eBay is not a bad source actually for some of it, but I also, I'm always.
You look everywhere.
I'm looking everywhere. Yeah. I'm going to go to the Chelsea Fair in 2 weeks. New York is a great place to look at books with all the auctions and all the shops.
Not that many shops, though, are there? Or are there?
Well,
not as many as there used to be.
Not as many as there used to be, and also like for this kind of material, often like antique shops are not a bad place to look. You know what I mean? Like it just gets thrown into boxes of paper.
Too. Do you do thrift shops?
Rarely do I go to thrift shops. Sort of. With a mission, although if I happen to be in a thrift shop, of course I look at everything. Yeah. But I do try to keep alert, and I do look online too. Always trying to reverse engineer searches. Like if I didn't know what this was, how would I describe it? And then type that in.
Yes. I was trying to sell this as fast as I could.
Right, if someone didn't know what it was, they might think that it was this. And
That's
are there any
good.
examples described as this out there? Well, because, so much of book selling, of course, is, in some respects, of course, things have prices. But for the most part, you decide what the price is, and you determine that by what your reputation is and what you typically bring to the material that you sell.
And I guess how much effort and labor you put into it.
How much effort and labor you put into it. And, if you're able to consistently write descriptions that elevate things and bring out aspects of them that make them attractive to people, then you can, often mark things up considerably, and people will pay it because they weren't going to find that. And they know that they don't have the time to do it.
So you wanted to be a professor, and then in your early 30s, now, was this a crisis? Was it a big crisis? Or was this just okay, I'm going to let go of this now, and I've seen another field that I'm quite interested in?
I mean, I would say that it probably was a crisis in a sense, in the sense that, I wanted to be an English professor from the time I was 16 years old, when I first read Sound and the Fury. And I pursued it with a really, really dogged type A, eldest child kind of, thing. And I just kept hitting the milestones, and certainly on paper it looked fantastic, but I really did not like academic writing, and I thought that would change.
Full of jargon, and is that it?
Well, yeah, it wasn't even the jargon, which I could make my peace with, but I wasn't interested in performing that way all the time.
Like always publishing
always
for the sake of
constantly
publishing
for the sake of publishing, constantly placing things for the sake of placing things, constantly just jockeying in this very small kind of closed system. It always felt like the price I was paying to do what I liked, which was to read and to teach and to talk about literature. And increasingly I began to feel like it was kind of a high price, and that I wasn't getting to like it any better. I thought, well, when you're young, you don't really know because you haven't really done that much. And I thought, I guess everyone just has like a big part of their work that they just hate and just really hate and just never want to do at all. And although, of course, there's some truth to that, it became really crystal clear in my postdoc when I had this wonderful postdoc at Princeton and a very light teaching load, and I was there to write this book for which I had a contract, and I was, it was like time to do this, and here I was, and everything was, I didn't have a child yet, everything was in place, you have a beautiful office, you have a research budget, like just sit down and write this book, and I just didn't write it, and I felt that was the only time.
You just couldn't get yourself to do it?
I just could not do it. I just literally just could not do it. I took 1 billion notes, I read 1 billion books, but I just could not write the book, and I thought, no one really knows on the outside that I'm not writing it because it kind of looks like I'm busy and, I'm still publishing things, so it feels like, but there was the only time in my entire life that I felt in bad faith. Like I just felt like a fraud because I felt like I'm supposed to be doing something and I'm just not doing it.
You tried to figure out why you weren't doing it.
I just don't want to do it. Like I just don't want it. And thought, if you don't want to do it this much, under these perfect laboratory conditions, there are no conditions under which you're going to do this. You're not going to get a tenure track job and start teaching 3 classes every semester and then do this. Like that's not going to happen. Like you'd be doing it right now if you wanted to do it and you don't. And so, but I also was at that point, in my early 30s, and I had a PhD, and I had no other. But I had no other. I wasn't sure what else to do, and then I realized that I had always had this real interest in rare books and manuscripts, and that actually had always been on the periphery of my life, but never at the center. So I went to Barnes & Noble, and I bought a Resumes for Dummies, because I had never written a resume, I only had a CV. But I took it back, and I thought I need to do like a skills-based resume, and I need to put all of the rare book and manuscript material at the center and sort of move all the academic stuff sort of to the side. And I wrote a version of that, and I wound up working for Bauman for 7 years. So it all worked out, amazingly enough.
Yeah, and I guess their hiring standards were pretty high, were they?
I gotta say, getting hired at Bauman was no joke. It took 3 interviews. Because I thought, well, essentially, like, I'm essentially going to become a shop girl, so it shouldn't really be that hard,
that's
right?
What reading your bio, that's what I thought.
Right,
But this is quite a step down.
Well,
for a PhD.
Certainly,
holder.
that's certainly how my dissertation advisor felt. But the truth is, though, it was hard to get that job, and I learned an enormous amount on that job. It was not an easy job. The sense of intellectual liberation I felt in my first year as a rare book dealer, when I was just literally reading John Carter and, just the basic bibliographies at night and just memorizing, just the points on books and reading all this material because, I was really good on the literature. But I remember in my final interview, David Bowman was like, so someone wants to build a collection of Western Americana. What are the 10 titles you feel should be in that? And I was like, I literally do not know any. I like Lewis and Clark. Like, I don't know what.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in the frontier, And he was like,
the way to do that is just simply to pick up the phone and call Bill Reese.
Well, yes, that is, and we did have a hotline to Bill Reese for occasions, but he was like, so you're going to need to read read some Western Americana. Let's like get you, get you some bibliographies. Let's get you like, oriented. And similarly, what would you do if someone was interested in economics? I was like, I literally could not tell you what you do. Like Keynes? I don't know.
So you needed to educate yourself about the high points first.
Yeah, well, you needed to know the top across the the way. And I thought I had a pretty solid liberal arts education, and I did. But I had always been specialized and always really literary.
Yeah.
And so it was incredibly liberating and interesting to suddenly realize that like I had to know a lot about polar exploration, and it was time to start like boning up on that. I got really, really good at Trivial Pursuit there for a few years. Like I just suddenly became, after years of academically drilling down into like the most narrow veins, suddenly to just be on the floor of a gallery like that's so bustling, where people are just walking in all the time and being like, I'm interested in Civil War hospitals. And you're like, well, here are some books that you should think about. Kind of like getting into that sort of model. It was enormously freeing. And I felt actually
but also daunting, no? I mean,
well, daunting.
All that
daunting, but
knowledge that you have to keep in your head.
It's true, but I didn't have to write articles about it. So that was like a huge dream. And I didn't have to grade anybody on it. I just had to learn it, to assimilate it for myself. And that actually was fun.
What were the top areas then? You say Arctic, you say Civil War, you say Western.
Bowman does, they do landmark books in all fields is their, is their tagline. Yeah. And that's pretty much, what it is. For every field, there's, of course, there's interesting, quirky material on the side, but there's like a steady core that is always present.
Yeah.
So we did a lot of, classic literature, sort of top 100, lists, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. We did a lot of travel and exploration. We did a lot of classic Americana, Federalist Papers, that kind of thing. A lot of economics. We were here in New York, so there were definitely, a lot of that. A lot of military history, tons of Churchill, tons of Civil War stuff, that kind of thing. We did a fair amount of botanical ornithology, pretty plate books, plants, birds, trees, children's books. Always, especially around the holidays, all the classic children's books. So you would get really good at, Oz and Alice in Wonderland and, all of the Pooh books, that kind of thing. Just those were constantly in and out all day. And so it was a great place to learn, because by the time I'd been there a few years, I just really had a very, I could just scout a fair so fast, for that kind of material. Like I just knew what the spines of the expensive books were, and like could go to them super fast. Right. So in that sense, it was good.
And obviously, you need to know what a good deal is too.
And you need to know what a good deal is, and what condition is, and how, what kind of material you're really looking for.
So what's the most important thing you learned during your time there?
besides all of the book knowledge, which was huge, I mean, and which I can't even quantify because it's the basis for what, I mean, all of the stuff I'd done up until then was important too, but just that incredibly intense, you know, selling hundreds and thousands of really like well-described books over and over and over again, and getting to the point where you could just look at them very quickly and say, this is why this is important, this is the selling point of this is the selling point of that kind of thing. Besides that, I mean, what Bauman taught me was how incredibly detail-oriented you have to be successful in business. I mean, that's really what I took from it. I don't think I could have...
What does that mean?
I mean, the attention to customers and customer service, to keeping good records on every book and every customer, to thinking long-term about plans for customers. That, I think, would have really... I don't think I would have been able to succeed at Honey and Wax if I hadn't seen the way that they had developed systems to just take care of the people who bought from them.
Get to know them as collectors.
Get to know them as collectors, follow up, make sure that their experience is always good, right? Make sure that they feel completely taken care of and that there's complete trust and that they feel comfortable sending something back, that they feel comfortable. The importance of that relationship as sort of the core of what's driving the business, not any individual sale, but about having someone who wants to work with you. Because, I mean, someone like Bauman, I mean, they sell the books at a premium, right? I mean, it's not like nobody goes to Bauman thinking like, oh, I'm just, gonna get the cheapest copy.
That's what I was going to say.
That's not going to happen. But people, why do people pay it then? You know, they pay it because they develop a relationship with their bookseller there, their assigned bookseller who sort of shepherds them, and they come to enjoy that connection and to rely on it.
Well, it's like a team together. You're
all working on something together, and that, you know, when people come into the gallery, they're greeted and they feel like it's like a respite from, you know, the rest of like all the awful things they have to do during the day. That, you know, it's this, you know, this place where like they can talk for, you know, 20 minutes about Shackleton and feel like refreshed and move on with their, you know, with their life. So I took so much actually away from that, about thinking long term about what it is you're actually doing for people. I mean, yes, you're bringing them books, and that is really important, but you are also engaging with them, you know, as a collaborator in something that should be exciting and fun and inspiring and like really something that they look forward to all the time.
And that a joyful part of their life.
Yeah, too. And it should be a joyful part. You should be communicating your joy in the books. And if you can't do that, then like you have to get off the sales floor. Like, you know, because it's like you're not gonna do it.
It's almost the opposite of the stereotype of a crusty old antiquarian book dealer.
Well, and that's like what was, you know, I mean, driven home to us constantly. Like you don't have the luxury to treat people like that. Like, you know, your job is to, you know, make everyone, even like the tourist from the Midwest who's clearly not going to buy a single thing, like make them feel really happy that they came, because maybe later they will, you know, they'll remember it or they'll talk about it. So I learned a lot working there, and I'm really happy to be working for myself and dealing with these books in the way that I want to, but I also found it, you know, hard to leave because it was a very stable, steady, supported place to work.
And plus you had a child you were raising on your own.
I had a child I was raising on my own, and you know, it was for those years of her childhood, it was, you know, an enormous comfort to you know, to have a job that I felt completely confident had my back, and, you know, that afforded us a comfortable life. So it was,
It's tough raising a child on your own.
Well, I mean, she does have a father who, you know, who lives here in the city too. She lives with me, and I have primary custody. But
I see,
you know, but you know, so I mean, it's not.
I see.
You know, I mean, I'm, you know, she's always lived with me, and so I'm a single parent in that sense. But I wouldn't want to discount the fact that she has another parent.
That's
too,
good.
So.
Yeah, let's say a word for
no.
in favor of him.
Yes, absolutely,
okay.
absolutely.
Good. Okay, so
Still, I do have to make enough money to live, though. So,
what's that?
But still, I do have to make enough money to live.
Yeah.
So that is a concern.
So really, it was a wonderful apprenticeship then.
That's how I think of it.
Yeah,
and feel really lucky to have had it.
So in 2011, you established Honey and Wax. So you're a productive little bee then.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, I started Honey and Wax, in my apartment.
Where did it come from?
So when I worked at Bowman, I was at a book fair one year, and I was looking at this 19th century grammar book. In there was the line, "Use books as bees use flowers," which was an example of analogy or something. And I thought it was so great that I wrote it down in my little notebook. I wish I'd bought the book now, but I didn't realize. But
that's part of the lore of
I
company.
got to find this book. Use books as bees use flowers. I just really liked it because it speaks to what I like about books and reading and communities of collectors and cross-pollination and the idea that you're taking things from all these different places and you're making new things out of them, and it's this endlessly renewable resource, these books that keep bringing, keep inspiring, keep giving new things out into the world. So I always really liked that. When I was thinking of doing my of leaving, I knew I didn't want to be O'Donnell Rare Books. I tried sort of various things and nothing really felt right, and then I came back to that quote and I just thought, well, how do bees use flowers? They make honey and wax. And I thought Honey and Wax Booksellers would actually be like, that's great, and it suggests whole iconography, like it's easy to imagine how it's going to look. And so that was how I came to it.
Okay.
And
so you don't collect books on bees?
I don't collect. I'm constantly being quoted books on beekeeping. People are like, would you like this? So I was like, no, that's not actually what I do. But thank you very much. Thank you for playing.
But fascinating. No, bees are fascinating.
Bees are fascinating,
and honey is really good for you. And
it's like sweetness and light. The the candles and the honey. Like it's all it's true. And what is really funny is that after I started, all these people were like, I got the reference, because Honey and Wax and the idea of bees and books is all through classical and modern literature. So everyone just assumed that I was referring to Horace, or I was referring to Jonathan Swift, or I was referring to, and I just let everyone think that I'm referring to whatever it is that they think I'm referring to. But it was actually that grammar book.
Okay. You make the point that it takes time to become an expert. We've just kind of gone through that period.
Yeah, right? I mean, I don't see any way around it.
Who do you think's the most knowledgeable bookseller you've ever met?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, Bill Reese would obviously have been a very strong candidate for that, in terms of that like encyclopedic.
Did you hang out there when you were in New Haven?
No, I didn't.
No. Okay.
I mean, he was in and out of the Beinecke, of course, all the time.
Yeah.
But I didn't really know him until I became a book dealer. But I learned a lot from him just watching.
Great catalogs too. Yeah.
Fantastic catalogs.
Yeah.
I mean, the booksellers who have been, who certainly were most inspirational to me in, in wanting to start Honey and Wax were people like mostly Brits, Amanda Hall and Simon Beattie and Sophie Schneiderman, people who had smaller operations but were incredibly sort of thoughtful and knowledgeable about what they were interested in, and wrote these catalogs that were so, sort of historically interesting and gave context for material I wasn't familiar with. And I really
love writing the story. I think that's a big part
I mean,
of
this, I would say narrative booksellers, who were telling stories about these books. But in terms of, I mean, obviously when you say who's the most knowledgeable, I mean, you would have to go with someone senior in the sense that,
I think you away.
I mean, I think James Jaffe is incredible, for what he does. I would trust him on any point of literary history, and his taste is so impeccable. So yeah, he's someone I greatly admire. But then I also admire, someone like Jim Cummins, who would never talk about himself as like someone, I mean, he doesn't like style himself as like an intellectual dealer or anything like that. But I mean, he literally has just handled so many millions of books that he he recognizes them like without. He almost doesn't even have to look at them. Like at this point, he just he has completely he is completely like just all of book knowledge is assimilated in his bones at this point, and he just really and I when I was a teenager I worked at the Strand, so I used to watch Fred Bass sorting the books. And that was always a fun thing to watch because he just did that so fast, and I didn't understand what I was looking at. I didn't understand what I was seeing. We were looking at the same objects, obviously, but he saw something completely different in all of them than I did. And that was really the first time I grasped that being a bookseller is not so much about knowing the text of what you're selling, although, that can be very important, but it's about having a feel for these as objects in a historical context and in a market, and knowing that without having to look it up. So that was really instructive.
I love the third floor at the Strand. It's one of these places where you can find some really good deals.
It's true because there's just so much stuff going through there. Like they could, they don't have time to deal with everything.
Bookselling combines some of the most rewarding aspects of research and teaching, plus there's no grading. Although I would take issue with that and say that you have to grade books. You
do have to grade books, but books don't complain. They don't come to your office hours in tears to talk about their medical school ambitions.
Okay, so what are the most rewarding aspects of the research and the teaching that you find in bookselling?
I mean, there's nothing I like better than picking up something that I don't entirely understand, but think is probably interesting, doing the work on it, discovering that it's more interesting than I thought it was, learning something that I didn't know before, and then writing it up and sharing that with a curator or a collector or some random person at a fair who comes into the booth, or sharing it on Instagram, sharing it, just with the public, look at this thing, look at what I found, look at this, isn't this interesting? That to me is really, it's what makes my job fun. It's what I enjoy. I wish I could do it all day, every day, and didn't also have to do like QuickBooks and packing and stuff like that.
You talk about the challenge of keeping both books and cash flowing.
Yes. Sometimes it seems like one is flowing, but the other is kind of stalled, then it flips. So, the reason I'm going to Chelsea in 2 weeks is that I just realized I'm running out of books. I've been working on this catalog and I haven't been buying, and we've got to get some books in here. So.
What's your stock typically?
Oh, I have a tiny stock. Usually I have about 200 books on hand, about 100 of which are like cataloged. But the thing about, my model is so extremely skewed. Like books, most of the books that I handle never go online. They're never, they just are going directly to where they're going. So by having a really high churn, I'm able to keep stock quite low. Like that's fine, But if it gets out of whack, like the stock is now actually too low, it needs to be higher. So I'm gonna go spend some money.
One of the most successful dealers in Canada is Attic Books. Marvin, he buys a ton of stuff, and there's always turnover in the shop. That's what I love as a patron. He's in London, Ontario, which is a ways away from me, but even online, every 3 or 4 weeks I check, there's new stuff there all the time.
That's what you want. Definitely I try as much as I can, at each fair that I go to have a fresh booth. Like I don't want people saying, oh, I've already seen that. I saw that last time. I saw that last time. I'm really trying to make sure that people always have something new and shiny to look at. I think if you can't provide that, it does begin to feel a little bit like a museum. Like here's my permanent collection of unsaleable material.
That's priced too high.
It's priced too high that I won't compromise on.
Okay, just winding down here. Speaking about prices, what do you think? You talked about, the fact that Henry James, for example, isn't in fashion right now. So is now a good time to buy him? I would say in general, I just discourage speculation of that kind in general. I think people should buy the books. They're always looking for a deal.
So
that's what I'm asking. What's a good deal? If you like English literature, or if you're interested in what you carry, What's a good deal these days?
I think I'm going to decline to answer it because I feel like there's no way to answer it that doesn't appear to be giving a recommendation that I just don't agree with. Like, I just don't think that's why people should buy, and I don't think anyone knows.
Okay.
I think if it were easy to know that, then everyone would do it, but no one does because no one knows.
Okay,
So,
but what about just certain things that you think have more value
than is currently recognized?
than is currently recognized, that are underpriced in that sense?
I think the one thing I would pay attention to, or that I would find interesting in books, that a lot of people don't pay as much attention to, are the circumstances of their publication. So, there are lots and lots of 19th century writers who published things weirdly. No, I don't. Even as I'm saying it, though, I don't really believe it, so I'm not going to say it.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I have a recommendation on that, and I just, I'm sorry.
It's not a recommendation, but let's move to what do you think are some of the most beautiful books that have ever been made?
Oh, well, certainly, as an antiquarian, I have great fondness for the early days of printing, even though I don't handle very much in the way of incunables. But for me, the romance of Aldous, that sort of, that mashup between the person who could create the Hypnerotomachia, this incredibly gorgeous, gorgeous book, but who also could produce the pocket classics that are the forerunners of, all the books I read in college, all the pocket paperback editions. I mean, he, to me, unites everything that I love about books, both the incredible material gorgeousness of the production and also the democratic, inspirational utility, the wide-ranging seeds all over the place, dropping all over Europe, just sending this text out there into the world. I mean, I've handled, Aldines from time to time. I've never bought one for myself because I don't really collect in that way. But if I ever want to treat myself to a special antiquarian book, I think it would probably be an Aldine. I would love to have a little piece of Aldous in my house because his work really inspires me and speaks to a lot of what I love about books and the book trade.
My impression of Honey and Wax was that you specialized in books by women.
A lot of people seem to think that. We do certainly handle quite a few, but if you look at our catalogs, actually it's not predominant. I think it's getting more so, actually. The new catalog I'm working on now does have a lot of women, and I think maybe it's because I'm being offered a lot of women's material these days because people are under the impression that that's my specialty.
Yeah.
And of course I'm happy to buy interesting material, whoever created it. So. But
speaking of undervalued, the women authors don't get the same prices that male authors.
It's complicated, but it's certainly true that there are no... I mean, certainly among, for instance, like modern writers of literature, women don't command the same prices as men. There are very few. Jane Austen, who...
the Brontes.
The Brontes. But, it's a really small number.
So there's an opportunity there.
There's an opportunity. I feel like there are other people who are working that angle, in a really disciplined way, like Alison Devers at the Second Shelf in London, who is really making it in I think a very positive way, a sort of public question about why we value work, have valued work differently. Is it always on aesthetic merit? Is even primarily on aesthetic merit? Not necessarily. It's it has a lot to do with the moment that material came out and what was perceived to be important and what was perceived to be trivial in those moments. And in retrospect, it doesn't always look like that was the right call. I am certainly interested in women and also children and working people and immigrants, people who were not the intended audience often of a lot of the stuff that I handle, but who made it their own or transformed it in some way. So in that sense, I think it's quite true. And the Honey and Wax Prize focuses on women collectors in an attempt to, to draw attention to the disparity in attendance at book fairs and in the book collecting world in general, which I think is changing, and rightly so.
I think it's odd because, particularly with fiction, women overwhelmingly are the readers, and yet they're not the collectors.
They're not the collectors.
Is there any reason for that?
I mean, I think there are lots of reasons for it. I mean, women tend to collect most things, not just books, less than men, and that's because they tend to have less money. So that's one of the obvious. But I think it's also true that the book world has traditionally been a kind of insular and in many ways male-dominated or even exclusive space.
Forbidding.
And that a lot of women who were avid readers, and actually often avid collectors, just didn't identify as collectors because they didn't see themselves as being a part of that world or a part of that project. And so a lot of what Honey and Wax and lots of other younger dealers are trying to do as we enter into, just a very different kind of space and market is to say there is not one particular model of book collecting and then everyone else falls short of that. There are multiple ways to think about collecting, and in truth, what would make my job much more interesting is if people would collect not so much the obvious books but less obvious material, and I would like to be receiving lists of less obvious material all the time from other dealers. Like, I would like to be seeing a lot more unusual material, and that only happens if collectors and dealers kind of expand their horizons a bit and get more curious about things that haven't always, whose value they don't already understand, if they were to pursue that more actively. So I care a lot about that.
Is it Jason Rovito?
Yes.
Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, Jason Rovito. Cloud Books, yes.
He's doing some interesting things.
Yeah, Jason always has interesting stuff. And he's very interested in the avant-garde, but also in all kinds of. I mean, did he not do a recent thing on prison?
Yes.
And incarceration?
Yeah.
He has a really, really interesting sensibility. I think that there's. I think people are increasingly aware of the way that private collectors shape the institutional landscape. That these great institutional collections were not built by the institutions for the most part. They're based on a bedrock of private collections that came into the institution and then became the scaffolding on which they built this accomplishment. And so private collectors are really important in terms of, it's not just a personal kind of thing. It's something that has real sort of historical implications. And
I think libraries should be supporting collectors to a much greater extent than they are. And
I think libraries are sort of waking up to the fact. I think that there's been for a long time a kind of silly, clannish, like private versus institutional, and one's good and the other's, that kind of thing. And that's ridiculous because it is all part of the same ecosystem, and strengthening any part of it strengthens all the parts of it. Without private collectors working hard to salvage material that right now institutions aren't interested in, institutions will never get that material. Like, they've got to start really reaching out to those people now and bringing that stuff in. And so part of what I think about constantly is just how to make people who aren't already inside this very cozy insular space of the Grolier and the ABA and, our little clannish, very comfortable but not particularly diverse world, understand that not just that it would be fun for them to do this or something, but that actually, like, they are 100% empowered, licensed, they should do it, they should not be discouraged by anything that anyone says to them. They should just go get the material. Just go get it. Just get it. And if you don't succeed at first with particular people, who cares? Like, people need to take control and, like, command of this material and really
Sorry, you missed your...
Oh, sorry.
What are you talking about exactly?
I would like to see a much broader swath of the population feel empowered to collect and to think of themselves as archivists and historians and people really thinking about the future, not feel like they're being silly or
Problem is, though, they're often rejected whenever they approach a library. The library rejects them all.
Of course they are. Of course they are.
How are they supposed to feel?
Well, of course, I mean, I'm not saying that their feelings are not amply justified by the treatment that they are likely to have received. But as someone who cares a lot about having a more representative historical record in institutions and in the trade, it's only private collectors who are gonna drive that engine. So they have to be supported and encouraged in whatever way we can think of to encourage them. And I certainly haven't found like the magic bullet for it yet, but the prize is one way of trying to recognize people and encourage people.
For that. Really, you should.
Well, the collectors should be congratulated for the amazing stuff that they're doing, you know, often with no encouragement until this prize. So I want to, I just want there to be more points of encouragement where people really feel like it's something that they, not just that they can do, but that they should do, that they're making a contribution to people they don't even know, you know, who maybe aren't even born yet. You know, it's something that I care about a lot, and sometimes when I see what seems to be just the extremely narrow tunnel vision of certain kinds of institutional priorities, it makes me sad, because I think so much is being lost right now. Like, so much could be collected, could be saved, could be celebrated, and it's not being, because the gatekeepers don't understand its values. So I obviously want to change the gatekeeping, but I also feel like part of what we just have to say is don't worry about the gatekeepers at all. Like, literally pay no attention to people who are telling you that what you care about isn't worth anything. Like, just don't pay attention. Just do it anyway.
That's a beautiful message. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Very last thing. Who won the latest prize, and what were they collecting?
The latest prize was won by a cartoonist here in New York City, Emily Forster, who started collecting fan-made comics, comics that participate in fictional universes that are, you know, established, published, copyrighted properties, but made by fans and distributed on underground channels. So no one is, you know, Marvel's not getting any money from this, like all the way, no one, like these are things that fans created for themselves and for other fans to trade. This is biggest in Japan, which has an entire, you know, really evolved culture of this trading, but also in the United States too, at things like Comic-Con and that sort of thing, people doing self-published zines that, you know, sort of interact in different ways with these different universes and remix them and bring characters together in ways that would never be sanctioned by the official owners of this property and that kind of thing. And so she had put together a collection of hundreds of these and wrote a really interesting essay, which is, you can read in its entirety on our website. There's a link to her winning application about, you know, the difference between art that is made for you know, commercial production and art that is made purely for sort of private consumption or for, you know, private trade, and the way that this has enabled a lot of people who don't traditionally have a voice in those communities to sort of enter in and participate, even though they're not getting paid. They're also not being controlled, so they have a freedom within this material that they didn't have before. What we loved about that collection was that it would be virtually impossible to reproduce. Like, you couldn't go online and just buy all that material. Yeah. You had to actually, like, go to those Comic-Cons, go to those, like, weird underground shops in Japan. Like, you had to go scout this material. But we also thought that is an archive that, you know, right now she's keeping because she's a working cartoonist and she loves it and it's what she collects, but that later on someday we'll have enormous, like, you can imagine how many dissertations could be written on what she has put together, like how much material is there, how many stories to be teased out of that. We just thought it was a great kind of mix of you know, interesting material that you don't usually see at book fairs, put together and talked about in an interesting way by someone who has thought a lot about what that material is and has, made some of it herself. So yeah, that was who won this year.
How can people get a hold of you?
Oh, just go to honeyandwaxbooks.com. I'm right there. I'm easy to find.
Well, thank you for being so forthcoming.
Thanks. That probably means indiscreet.
I've been talking to Heather O'Donnell, who is how do you like to be referred to, as a proprietor, or is that too?
I think you could just say Heather O'Donnell, owner of Honey and Wax Booksellers.
Very good. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me.